thank all of you for coming today. We're really excited about the program, and I think that you're really in for a treat. We had the Hailmans at lunch with us today, and we just got carried away with listening, so I can't wait for you to hear the author. I do want to ask Mrs. Hailman to please stand and be recognized. If you would look at your program, you will see this is the first program we've had this fall, this semester, that is sponsored by the Collins Speaker Series. And if you'll look on the back of your program, you will see our sponsors there. And I won't go into the explanation there, but I hope you'll read about Dr. Collins. I know that some of you in the audience knew Dr. Collins, and he was really an inspirational individual who really got us thinking about having this Collins Speaker Series, and we named it in his honor because he was really so intent and so excited about bringing individuals to our campus so that they could share with us and we could get to know them, and especially for our students. So I'm so glad we have students here today. But this is sponsored also by the Congressional and Political Research Center here at the library, the John C. Stennis Institute of Government, and the John C. Institute Center, the John C. Stennis Center for Public Service. Rex, forgive me, I never get that straight. You would think after all these years I remember, but I just don't get it straight. And also on our program today, you will hear from Dr. Jerry Gilbert, who is our Provost and Executive Vice President. You will have remarks from Dr. Eddie French, who is the new Interim Director for the Stennis Institute of Government. And then Rex Buffington, who is the Executive Director of the John C. Stennis Center, will introduce our speaker because they served with Senator Stennis. I don't think, if I remember correctly, you all did not serve together. Is that right? You kind of crossed over. Then we'll hear from our special guest, John Hailman. And as I said, he said, well, how long do I have? He said, you know how attorneys do go on. But we have some of his books for sale today, and it's From Midnight to Guntown. And it's really, I had the opportunity to read the book, and I encourage you to do it. It's really interesting. It kind of holds your attention, and there was sometimes in there that I thought, John, that you all were in danger. He also worked with several of the individuals whose papers we have here in the Congressional and Political Research Center. So our lives and our history in Mississippi are all entwined, and this is really a wonderful time for us to be together and to learn more about it. And also, Mr. Hailman has some, he served with Senator Stennis, and he will tell you that when Senator Stennis was shot, if you all remember that. And he has some papers that he will be presenting to the university today, and will officially present those to Dr. Gilbert and on behalf of the library. So you're really in for a good treat, and then you will get to meet Brianne Pettigo, who is the president of the Stennis Montgomery Association. And they do great things. They and all these young people get together, and then they talk about going to Washington, and they write about it. So you're in for an excellent afternoon. So thank you for coming. And with that, I would like to ask Dr. Gilbert to come forth and do the official welcome.
Thank you, Dean Coleman. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Central Administration. I'm Jerry Gilbert, the Provost and Executive Vice President, and I am very excited about this Morris Collins Lecture Series. It's a really excellent opportunity for us to bring some outstanding scholars to the campus and really give the opportunity to our students, our faculty, and our staff to really interact with a great scholar. I knew Bill Collins in the early 90s. I had the opportunity to meet him, and I can tell you he was a very interesting man, a real gentleman, and a great scholar in our political science department. So if you didn't have the chance to ever know him, this is a very fitting tribute to him to name this series after him. Also had the opportunity to look at the bio of our speaker, and I must say it's very, very interesting, the life experiences that John Hailman has had. I'm interested that he's an expert on wines, also an expert in the political arena, many different interests that he has, and really what many would consider a modern Renaissance man when you read about him. He's just done so many interesting things. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to hear from a very wise and interesting man today, a great scholar, and it's our pleasure to welcome him here to Mississippi State. So I welcome you on behalf of Dr. Keenum and the Central Administration, and I can tell you I think we're in for a real treat. So thank you for coming.
I'm Eddie French. I'm the Interim Director of the John C. Stennis Institute of Government and Community Development here at Mississippi State. On behalf of the Stennis Institute, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. I'd like to thank Dean Coleman for letting the Stennis Institute be a small part of this lecture series. As Dr. Gilbert has just said, Dr. Bill Collins was the first director of the Stennis Institute, and so this is a very valuable exercise, and the Stennis Institute is a proud sponsor. But I'd also like to welcome you here today on behalf of the Stennis, not just the Stennis Institute, but the Stennis Montgomery Association. For those of you that do not know, the Stennis Montgomery Association is a totally student-run organization. We have students that they come from all walks of life. They come from every major. They're very involved in politics and public policy. As a matter of fact, we had our first introductory meeting last night where we had roughly 70 students show up. The students, they earn points throughout the year. This is one example today. Some students are here to earn points. We try to take roughly 25 to 30 students to Washington, D.C. and to Jackson every year and introduce them around. They write essays. They are very active. We have today a number of students here that are with the Stennis Montgomery Association. I'd like to point out Bree Pettigo is our outgoing president of the association. And we also have Caroline, where's Caroline? We also have Caroline Collins, who will be the new incoming president of the Stennis Montgomery Association. And on behalf of the Stennis Montgomery Association and the Stennis Institute, I'd just like to say welcome and thank Dean Coleman for letting us be a part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and we're so pleased to be a part of this from the Stennis Center for Public Service. It really means a lot to us to always have an opportunity to work with the Stennis Institute and with the Stennis Collection, the library, and of course, we're so glad that the Collins Lecture Series brings us together because there's so many wonderful memories in that connection. Of course, this is sort of a day of connections. For me, I've really, for a long time, wanted to have John Hailman come and speak here at Mississippi State, and we actually have been working on it for a long time. John and I didn't work together on Senator Stennis' staff. We were there at different times, but you know, it's kind of like the connection and the bond that we have at Mississippi State. Once you've been here and you're an alum, you're connected no matter when you were here, and that's the way those of us who had the opportunity of working for Senator Stennis are too. We feel a connection and an affinity whether we actually ever got to work side by side or not. We do share that common blessing of having worked for Senator Stennis. I actually came along in Senator Stennis's office I guess about 5 or 6 years after John had been there. But it's interesting, you know, he's such a distinguished and such an incredible leader, and he's had such an amazing career as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office that he wrote about in this book, and he's won awards, you know, everywhere he's been and been recognized for so many different things. But I remember when I was in Senator Stennis's office, we were constantly getting calls of people looking for John Hailman. And so I thought, well, gosh, you know, this guy really is impressive. And come to find out, it was all people who wanted to ask him questions about wine. It was not any legal issue or political issue. It was about wine. He had actually been the wine columnist for the Washington Post while he was serving on Senator Stennis' staff, which seems a little incongruent to me in some ways, but he obviously did a really good job in both of those positions because people were constantly looking for him because they needed to ask him something about wine. But he is really, he truly is a person who has been so remarkable and has done so much in so many different ways and has made a great impact. Of course, he comes to us from up north, from Oxford, and he's done such an incredible job there. He actually is a Millsaps undergrad, and has had amazing opportunities to study and to learn all over, and does actually have a law degree from the University of Mississippi, and actually has taught at the law school at Ole Miss, where I am sure some of his most outstanding students are Mississippi State graduates, right? We know that's bound to be the case. In fact, some of them are here today. So he has he's just done so many wonderful things and has made such an incredible impact. And he's such a great storyteller. I think it's really interesting that the real reason that he wrote this book, From Midnight to Guntown, was that he was at an event in Austin, Texas, as the story goes, and there are always good stories. And some friends said, come with me, we're going someplace. Well, it ended up being at Willie Nelson's ranch. And of course, he had the opportunity to tell a lot of stories that night that really entertained Willie Nelson. So he said, you should write a book. And he did. So I think if Willie Nelson suggested I should write a book, I would too. So, but I want to say a special word of thanks also to Leilani Salter for her patience and perseverance in getting all of this together. We did try actually last year when the book was first out to get John here, and we worked on opportunities to get him here, but his health issues kind of put him to the side. But I want to say, even in that, John Hailman finds a way to win awards because he won the award for the Cardiac Rehab Patient of the Year in Oxford this year. and maybe of all the awards he has, that may be the one that he's proudest of, right? Because that was a really good one too. But he is a person of great intellect and great integrity. He's somebody who does have so many stories to tell. I'm glad he's done it in his book, and I'm glad that he's consented to come here today and share those stories with us, and particularly those that relate to John C. Stennis. So please welcome our speaker and my friend, John Hailman.
Well, I have to thank Rex for that. I'm always a little nervous about being introduced. I remember once a guy I thought was a good friend of mine, I was going to give a speech at Judge Katie's retirement, the federal judge from Greenville. And he said, well, John Boy, how do you want me to introduce you? I said, man, Jack, we've known each other for years. Just introduce me however you think. And so he gets up, and I was representing about 40 former law clerks of Judge Katie. And he said, first thing he said was, well, now, some of you may not know exactly what a law clerk is, but Spiro Agnew, the vice president, once said, law clerks are an elite corps of impudent snobs. So I said, well, that's the last time I'm ever going to tell anybody to introduce me any way they want. But I'm glad. I didn't know Rex knew that story about the Cardiac Rehab Patient of the Year. I was in rehab for a whole year, working out 3 times a week at the hospital with all these test tubes on you. And but the award was really great. They gave me a little heart that you can put your pills in. That was but the best part of the award was I got to throw out the first pitch at the first game of the Ole Miss Auburn series. And I worked on it for a week and actually threw a strike. Ole Miss swept the series and went on to the College World Series, the first time in many years, probably 40 years. So that was, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a proud moment. I'm also glad to be here in the John Grisham room and to see some students out there. I noticed our distinguished group on the dais mentioned that you were getting credit. Is everybody here signed up? Are you going to get, you're good for credit? Good, okay. I can tell the students bright-eyed. That would mean a lot to Senator Stennis. That was why he founded all this. He appointed me to a group called the Stennis Council back in the 70s, and its purpose, oh, there we go, somewhat inappropriate, but it's a bottle. It's, those are 5 volumes of the transcript of the trial of the men who shot Senator Stennis. And it's in a, I just happen to have an empty wine case. For a prosecutor, it's good that you probably can see it. It's a picture of a prison with a searchlight called Big House Red. At $10 a bottle, I recommend it. It's a good wine. Anyway, I like being here in the John Grisham room because y'all would not expect this, but John was a trial lawyer on his own, just like his first book, A Time to Kill. That was pretty much like his story. And I tried a few cases against John. I remember my favorite, I'll just tell you one brief one. He was in the legislature for several years. He liked the legislature, but he really hated practicing law, just hated it. Said, this is a miserable way to earn a living. That's when he started writing. So he came in and he was representing a fellow legislator, a state senator, who shall remain nameless, that we were investigating for an arson where it looked like he had burned his own business for the insurance money. And he came in, he's a big fat guy, and he was sweating profusely, and he was kind of shaking, and John came with him, and John was looking very distinguished and lawyerly. And he sits down, and our deal was, we didn't have a very good case, so I gave him a high noon shootout proposal. I said, John, if your man can pass a polygraph from this FBI polygraph expert, I'll give him a walk. We'll just let him, if he passes this polygraph, I believe he's not guilty. If he fails it, he pleads guilty. So John took the deal. And they come in, and the guy's shaking and sitting there and looking nervous, and his eyes are darting around. And John was already looking at him sideways. And my polygraph examiner is a very wise man. He's done some really famous spy and terrorism cases. He looks at the guy and looks him up and down. He said, you took some pills to beat my machine, didn't you? And I says, no, sir, no, sir. Yeah, he did. I'm concerned about you. I think your health is in danger. And by this time, John's looking at the guy like, whoa, what have I gotten myself into? So finally, the guy says, look, either tell me what pills you took, or I'm going to call a hospital and have you checked in the emergency room. The guy said, okay, well, I took some beta blockers. He said, well, are they on a prescription? He said, well, yes. So how many did you take? So 7 or 8 or 9. And he said, why did you do that? And he said, well, I read this little book that said, it would help calm you down before you take a polygraph. He said, is that your prescription? No, it's my wife's prescription. He says, turns to John and said, Mr. Grisham, your client is he's a very sick man. He's about to be a dead man. So I suggest that you take him to the doctor. I can't polygraph him in this condition. And I really admire John. He was probably the straightest, most honest lawyer I ever dealt with. He said, excuse me, gentlemen, we're going next door and have a little chat. And John gets up and he has to help the guy, helps him out the door, and they get next door. And I hear this big crash right against the wall. You can tell John's thrown the guy up against the wall. And he comes back in, and the guy's even more pale than before, and John's sort of red-faced. He says, John, we're going straight to the doctor. You won't be seeing me in this case again. I'm not going to represent this man. Anyway, that was a little John Grisham story. I love being back at Mississippi State. Back in the old days when Mississippi State had a winemaking school, it was a great time. Let me get this from my wife, my poor long-suffering wife. Our timing was bad. My new book comes out on Friday. It's called The Search for Good Wine. Wish I had, but this is a unedited copy. But it has a couple good stories in there. One of them is a really good one about the winemaking school here at Mississippi State. And they weren't sure, since there's still a good many teetotalers around, I'm sure there's none here, but there are a good many teetotalers in the state. And they had a winemaking school, so they didn't want to call it a winemaking school. They call it the McKay School of Food and Enology, something or other, and figured people didn't know what enology was. I hope they didn't. I was here several times. They had not only winemaking school, but they had, for the purpose of entertaining legislators and raising money for Mississippi State, we had fancy dinners. They had a chef from New Orleans who cooked, and we would drink Mississippi State wine. So I wrote a couple of glowing articles about the school saying, eat your heart out, Ole Miss. State now has wine to go with his cheese. So those articles are in this new book. It's a history of my lifelong search for a good, cheap wine. So I remember the first time we came up here, they sent a plane down, or up to Oxford, and picked us up and flew us down here for dinner. I don't know if I've ever driven to Starkville before. I think I've always flown an airplane. When I worked with Senator Stennis, I got to tie that into wine somehow. I'm going to tell you a few stories about Senator Stennis. He was just a wonderful man, but he was not necessarily the man that everybody thought he was. I see some people here who probably knew him personally, but he was a fascinating man. I said one thing, I had two different sections in this book, From Midnight to Guntown. One was all about the trial of the men who shot him, robbed him. The other was about how I went to work for him. And I remember one thing after I went to work for him, one thing we used to do to my wife, poor long-suffering wife's chagrin, he'd call about 6:30 or 7 on Saturday morning and said, "Are you busy this weekend?" And of course, what do you say to the chairman of the Armed Services Committee? I said, "No, sir." I said, "Well, we're going to fly down to DeKalb and we're going to visit the Naval Air Station at Meridian, as the most visited, scrutinized facility in the country. And we'd get on a little plane with the lobbyists from either the Air Force or the Navy or the Army, and we'd fly and we'd eat filet mignon and drink good wine. But we always made a stop. We'd go out to, what's that place in Maryland where it's named Camp David. We'd stop out at Camp David, and we'd fly down to Mississippi. But we always had to stop at a particular wine store where I used to work, because Senator Stennis's spinster sister, Janie, was a great wine lover. She loved German wines, and he'd always have me go by, and I'd have a padded satchel. And of course, Kemper County was dry, and I had a padded satchel, and we'd wrap them up carefully, get 8 or 9 or 10 bottles of really fine Riesling from the Mosel Valley in Germany, and take it to Janie, Miss Janie, we call her. So it's kind of combined wine and politics. But traveling with a senator was always just fascinating. I know Reagan and I were living in Washington, and I had taken a fellowship at Georgetown Law School, a graduate fellowship. It was supposed to last 2 years. And to make a long story short, it just bombed out. I was miserable. I just was totally out of place. I was the only one there who was not, it was one other guy. There were 6 of us fellows, and it was a prestigious deal. I don't think I deserved it, but they gave it to me. 4 of the 6 failed a background check because they had criminal records. They had all been locked up for protesting the Vietnam War. And there's one other guy and I thought at the time he and I were Mr. Straight, but he later ended up in Kansas City representing the mafia. His name was Frank Anzalone. They called him the Big Bomb Anzalone. So he was the closest thing we had to a straight guy in the group. Anyway, I had to get out of there. And we didn't have any other way to make a living there, and we were broke. And I had clerked for 2 years for Judge Cady, who was known as the civil rights judge. He had desegregated half the schools. There was another judge who desegregated the other half. And he was just like a second father to me. And he called to ask me to interview a law clerk candidate who was in Washington. He said, "Well, John, how's things working out at Georgetown?" I said, "Judge, I'm miserable. I'm lost here. I don't know what to do." And he said, "Well, I hadn't even thought of that, but Senator Stennis called me yesterday. He's looking for a lawyer for his staff in Washington." He said, "Do you think he'd be interested in that?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I've always admired him from a distance, but I've never met him." He said, well, he said, I'm not really like this. He said, you'd be going from the most liberal judge in the United States to the most conservative senator. How would you feel about that? And I said, well, if it pays well, I'll do it. So I called the senator's office and made an appointment for an interview. And I went in the following Monday, and he had this really fine leather couch. It was very soft, really expensive leather. It would hold like 5 or 6 people. So I sat down at one end. My appointment was like at 1 o'clock. Say 1:30 came around, nobody there. And I had this wonderful secretary named Goldie Pence. If y'all who knew the senator knew Goldie, she'd always answer the phone if you called, and I'd say, so-and-so Stonis's office. And it's just unmistakable accent. You knew you weren't talking to somebody from New Jersey. So-and-so Stonis's office. And his personal private executive secretary was Mildred Ward, the first cousin of the actress Celia Ward. Y'all probably seen her, done very well in Hollywood. Anyway, Mildred was a beautiful lady, about 50, and she, like all the senator's secretaries, were in love with him. I mean, nothing off color, but you would just respect him so much. Anyway, Mildred came out, and she sat down and chatted with me a little bit, and went back to her little private office there at the front. And then pretty soon another staff member come by and said, I'm sorry, the senator is so tied up. He's just so busy. He's had to run over to the floor for a vote, and I'm sure he'll see you in a few moments. Finally, about 3 o'clock, Mildred came back and said, well, John, the senator's not going to be able to get to you today. Can you come back Wednesday? Okay, so I come back Wednesday and sit there again, and no senator. And once again, different people from the staff, the legislative assistant, the press secretary, they all come to talk to me. And I'm sitting there, and I still thought, well, he's just a very busy man. They certainly seem to be voting more than usual. So I finally agreed to come back on Friday. So Friday, I come back once again, and this time he ushers me right into his office. And it was in January. It was very cold outside, typical Washington. It was snowing, and they ushered me into his office. I went through this little hallway lined with books, and I was looking at everything, seeing what it's like in this huge office. And he's sitting at the end with his back to the window, and you see him, he's framed in the background, it's like a picture frame, is the U.S. Capitol. And he's sitting there, and he was the age then that I am now, 72. He was very vigorous and had a really strong baritone voice. And he stood up and says, come in, sit down. I looked around, he had a fire going in the fireplace, real wood, and over the mantel was a huge portrait of Thomas Jefferson. I later came to know that portrait well. It was Jefferson in his second term as president when he lived in the White House. His wife was deceased, and he's got a fur collar on. You all may have seen that painting. And he looked like he was freezing to death. His cheeks were kind of red like he'd been out in the cold, I thought. And then it suddenly dawned on me, wait, I heard somewhere that the senator, although he died in the wool bulldog, he went to law school at the University of Virginia and was a big Virginia man and a big Jeffersonian. So anyway, he sat me down and said, I don't know if you'll be interested in this job or not. And he said something that tipped me off, said, I didn't know it. I've been being interviewed now for 3 days. That time sitting on the couch, his staff was interviewing me first. They just seemed to be offhandedly chatting, but it was really, there were interviews, and I think he didn't want me to know. Anyway, he'd already made up his mind. He hadn't even met me yet. And he said, well, what you're going to be doing if you're interested in this job, you're going to have 2 jobs, problem solver and troubleshooter. And you're going to have plenty of both. And he had, I have to be careful what I say, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but he had a couple of staff members. His main staff member was a man named Eve Cresswell, whom those of y'all who know the senator know. He had been his chief of staff since the 40s. And he had had a big conflict with the senator's outgoing press secretary, a man named Bill Spell, who went down and managed a Republican campaign for governor against Bill L. Lane, turned into his humongous scandal. Anyway, the dust was still flying when I got there, and I was stepping into that. And the one person I had not met was Eve Cresswell. I wasn't sure why. But anyway, the senator says, so I have a legislative assistant. But now the irony is just dawning on me. He said, he's had 5 heart attacks in the last 4 years, and said he's not able to do quite all the things I'd like him to do. But he's a major general, retired. in charge of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I need him to get the Tennessee Tom Bigby waterway approved. And then he said, my press secretary is a young man, and he sort of pauses and doesn't say anymore. You could tell there was some sort of problem. So he said, you're going to handle all the press activities that have to do with law. And he paused, which is just about everything. So anyway, and he said, you're going to do the legislation, everything except, I should see a familiar face. Yeah, oh my God. You're in the book. Okay. My good friend, the former sheriff, Dolph Bryan. There's a great, this book is worth reading, if for nothing else, just about the Dolph Bryan story. Case where, the one case where I almost got killed. This people he was after, one of them assaulted me in chambers, tried to choke me in the judge's chambers, and later was in a shootout. And anyway. And so I called Dolph, I'm going to get off that story. I called Dolph Bryan, y'all's very distinguished, wonderful former sheriff. I called Dolph and told him what happened. And he said, what are you surprised about? He said, well, anyway, well, it's good to see Dolph. It's old times. So anyway, the senator says, well, you can choose your own title. Can you start next Monday? You can choose your own title. So I thought, well, let's see, I can't be legislative assistant, I can't be press secretary. So I looked at some titles around, and I saw, unfortunately, you remember the infamous John Dean, who worked for President Nixon and turned witness against him and got him impeached. Well, he was called legal counsel. And I was 29 years old. I thought, legal counsel for the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, that sounds pretty damn good. So I told him, I'll be legal counsel. And he had these business cards printed up, and I sent my parents some. I'm legal counsel. And I guess I should, my favorite thing is digressions. I think I'll digress from my previous digression. Senator Stennis was also chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee, the first chairman. And he was, I'm not exaggerating here or flattering him, but he was called the conscience of the Senate. He had been a circuit judge in Mississippi, a district attorney, and he really was. He was just a man of just, it's hard to say somebody had impeccable integrity. It sounds overdone, but that was him. So they made him chairman of the Ethics Committee. Well, I didn't work on his committee staffs. I was on his personal staff. And I thought everything was going along fine. And then one time, I knew that there was a football pool in the Senate among the staffers, not the senators. But I knew it was totally illegal. I knew there were thousands of dollars being bet on college and pro football games. But I've never been a bettor, because if you bet on a game, it ruins the game. You're worried about your bet. You're not worried. I love sports, all sports. That's how I got to Mississippi. They recruited me to play basketball and baseball at Millsaps. I was already there by the time they could find out I wasn't very good. So anyway, so they came to me and said, look, the head of the chief of staff of the ethics committee has got to go to a funeral, and there's several $1,000s that you have to collect from the losers and pay the winners, and there's nobody else that we trust to do it but you. So there was. I'd been with a senator, oh gosh, hardly any time. There I was collecting and paying off illegal bets. A serious federal offense. That's how relaxed it was in some ways. But I just had a wonderful time working for the senator. He would, remember my favorite times would be, I had a little office, just wonderful. I looked out, and you looked out the window. In front of you was the U.S. Capitol, magnificent building. Looked over to your left, U.S. Supreme Court. You can see the steps and the marble columns. It was just plush. And I was like by the back door of his office, and he'd just open the door. He'd come out his office door and come down the hall to where mine was, stick his head in and said, "Come walk with me." Sweetest words there. And so I'd go running out, and we'd walk down. We'd get on this little subway that runs over to the Capitol. And as we was going along, here was the vice president, here was the head of the Senate, all these famous senators. I was just blown away. We get over to the Senate. He takes me in and introduces me. It's in the congressional record when he introduces me. And he takes me on the Senate floor and he introduces me. This is the Secretary of the Senate. I thought, Secretary of the Senate, what's the big deal? It turned out he was a real power broker, a man that really had a lot of authority there, introducing me to the chaplain and everything. it wasn't until much later that he showed me the real inner Senate, which was what, to me, resembled the Roman baths. They called it the Senate gym, but that was no gym. It was solid, beautiful travertine, whatever it is, marble. And they had little cubicles made of marble. And they had massages any time of day you wanted. They had their own Senate barber shop, get a free haircut, anything you wanted. They later had to change it up a little bit. I remember I knew when he trusted me, that he actually really trusted me, that came to know me. He had his aide, they called him, he was really a chauffeur, a guy named Troy Brown. He sent him out for Grecian formula. And he had his Grecian formula. And I noticed you have to be really careful. I know if you see the pictures of Sonny Montgomery, most of them there's distinguished gray hair. One time he had a bad experiment when he tried Grecian formula and ended up red. Watch for those. There's 3 or 4 where his hair was bright red. So Senator Stennis was very careful. He didn't want to have white hair, but on the other hand, he wanted to look natural. So it was a certain way he wanted it, and had me bring it down to him in what they call the gym, which I call the Roman baths. And I brought it to him, and he was wearing this long not terry cloth, a really fancy robe, and he'd been actually working out on a machine, and I thought, this is really like the Senate in ancient Rome. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, I brought him his Grecian formula, and he got to where I would run that kind of errand for him. Proud to do it. So that's one little additional digression. But he took me as a sounding board. He'd run things by me, and he said, now, okay, this is one of the first ones I remember was before Richard Nixon was disgraced in Watergate, Vice President Agnew was caught taking bribes, cigar boxes full of $100 bills, right there in the old executive office building next to the White House. Turned out he'd been taking bribes since he was a senator. And he denied it, so they started cranking up, and the senator, as head of the ethics committee, was researching what you do to impeach a vice president. So he assigned me that, research impeachment. How do you do it? The Senate sits as the trial jury, and the House of Representatives sits as a grand jury, and you charge him with a crime, and then you remove him from office. Well, I studied that, and it was fascinating. And by that time, Spiro Agnew, the distinguished Spiro Agnew, copped a plea. I don't know if y'all know this, but to a lawyer, it's fascinating. He wouldn't plead guilty. He pled something called nolo contendere. I don't contest it. And the deal was that he'd get probation if he resigned from office immediately. And he did. So I didn't have to research that anymore. Then the senator says, okay, you've done that one. He said, now, I'd asked him how much he wanted. And he said, you can write 100 pages if you want to. It'd be nice for the record if I ever have to look it up. But said, from now on, as long as you work for me, I want talking papers. And a talking paper is one sheet of paper in big print with appropriate heading and what that nowadays we'd call it bullet points, but they didn't have that term back then. He said, I want to be able to look at one piece of paper, pull it out of my pocket, and know everything that's worth knowing about the topic, pro and con. It was really a great organizational scheme. So the next topic he gave me was the filibuster rule. And of course, the filibuster was then thought of as a Southern way to delay on civil rights litigation and other legislation. But he wanted it across the board, and he told me the filibuster rule is being abused. I want it amended. This is the United States Senate. I had tremendous respect for the Senate. I want it amended. I want it to be fair. I don't know if I didn't learn until a couple of months ago. I never thought of where filibuster came from. But in the old days, I think it's probably Irish, filibuster was like a pirate. I don't know how they tied that to the talking yourself to death on the Senate floor like Senator Cruz did recently. Anyway, that was the next thing I worked on. But speaking of the senator's organizational system, I don't have anything to illustrate it with. I got a little Splenda, that's not quite appropriate. He would be at the Senate all day, and about 5 o'clock, he would go to the gym, they called it, and he would work on these machines. Then he'd take a big shower, and he'd put on a new fresh suit, and at 7 p.m. every night, we'd have a staff meeting. And we'd been there since 8 in the morning. We were all tired, and we hadn't been to the gym. And he would come in just full of energy. And he loved to go around the Senate floor and just talk to everybody. And he emptied his pockets. And his organizational scheme was little tiny pieces of paper that he'd write notes on. And he'd toss them out on the desk, and he'd lay them down, and he'd get the wrinkles out of them. And he'd say, Miss Edna or Miss Mildred, come in here. And he'd dictate these little memos outlining all these things. And sometimes it'd just be 2 or 3 words. And he'd have like 15 or 16 different important topics. And that was his scheme, was just write them on a scrap of paper. He liked the informal touch of dealing with people. So then he'd hand out these memos to each of us. And we had what we called our take-home. Every night, we'd have a folder or a little briefcase, and we'd take it home to work with us. And so that was, I mean, he worked hard, and he worked us hard, but he was always, I remember one thing I said in this book, you don't know what you're going to say usually till after you've said it, especially if you're a trial lawyer. But one of my favorite sentences in his book is, I never knew anyone who said fewer trivial things. His mind was always, he was interested in life and interested in people. He never gossiped. He didn't talk about anything low down. He just, I don't know, he was fascinated by everything. So I think my favorite time ever on his staff was not just getting, you got the same ringtone I do. Thought that was me. No, I'm good. Funding for the Natchez Trace Parkway. That was a big deal. Loved it. We used to go to to Nashville, since it's finished now, to visit our daughter at Vanderbilt there where her husband was. And I won't list them all, but the Port of Gulfport, the river development, channeling, the Tennessee and Tombigbee Waterway, just so many things he did for Mississippi that nobody realized. Just he had his finger in everything. I'd give him a list of 15 items. I couldn't believe one man could have his finger in so many pies. But one time he got an unusual assignment. And speaking of which, this is also my clock. That's it. I've already run over, haven't I? Okay, well, he said, now, next week, I'd like you to go to Montana with me. I'd never been to Montana. That sounds good. He said, I can't tell you much about it, but a dispute has broken out between Mike Mansfield, the senator from Montana, majority leader, who was later ambassador to Japan, very distinguished senator, and a strange bird named Harold Hughes, who was a long-haul truck driver from Iowa, who somehow in a moment of taxpayer rebellion got elected to United States senator. And he and Mansfield were just fighting like cats and dogs, and it was embarrassing the Senate. So what they call the inner club, like the 10 most influential senators got together and asked Senator Stennis, can you get these guys together? Can you settle whatever their dispute is? Can you work it out? So he agreed to do it. He never told me what the dispute was, so we got on a plane. We flew to Montana. If you see in my book, there's several pictures of us out there in Montana. And we got in these little 3 or 4 person planes and these little Jeeps, and we drove all over Montana. And I loved it because we went trout fishing every day, and every night we'd eat half a steer that was cooked in a pit on the ground. And on that trip, I finally learned what my true role was as a senator's legal counsel. Was a big rancher with his big hat. We'd been drinking beer all evening and singing. They loved to sing together out loud. And we're gathered around a big fire, and we're checking out and getting in our car, and rather a Jeep. And he says to Senator, it's been an honor receiving you, and we know you're going to look out for us in the Senate, and your career is really remarkable, and we thank you very much, and we count on you. And he looks at me, and he can't think of what to say. He's going to say something nice. He says, and John Boy, you handle the details. So that was my job. I think I handled the details. But anyway, in January of 1973, just we're planning a huge legislative year. I get a call. Well, I drove the senator to a speech to the National Guard, and he said something. Later, I realized what he was saying. We'd been there an hour or so. He says, "Look, this is going to last another couple of hours. You you go home. I drove him in my car. He says, you go home to your young wife, and I'll drive myself home. I'll get somebody to take me to the office building and go back. I said, well, thank you, sir. That's good. I hadn't thought about the fact that he was 72 years old. When he said that, it really struck me years later. He said, your young wife. It was not like your old wife, your young wife. I think it was sending me a message. Anyway, so I went home, and Reagan and I were out on the back porch in Georgetown having a nice dinner, and we had a call from Mildred Warden. She says, John, I'm in no shape to drive. I've had a terrible news. The senator's been shot. It was a street robbery in front of his house, and he's not expected to live. Can you please come and drive me to the hospital? I said, of course, Mildred, of course. I'll be right there. So I get in the car, and we go down to Walter Reed Hospital. And the first thing I heard was, Sam Donaldson, Connie Chung, and a bunch of senators. I mean, there's Scoop Jackson, Lloyd Benson. Lloyd Benson's there. He's in a fanciest tuxedo I ever saw. They've come from parties. A huge crowd is gathered. And the word was, he's not going to live through the night. And what happened was the wound, he was shot once in the leg, and he's 72 years old, and the bullet, it's like a 25 caliber, it shattered. Instead of breaking his leg, it hit his leg bone, and the bullet shattered. But it was a police round that had a copper jacket on it, and it broke in several pieces, and the surgeon came out and told us, Major Muir, Army surgeon, said, well, the wound in the leg will probably be infected, but we can pick those pieces out later. So the problem is one bullet to his abdomen managed to both hit his pancreas. Pancreas is skinny, flat organ. It managed to hit it from the side and cut it in two pieces. He said all I could do, and then his portal vein, which is the vein that brings blood back from the lower part of your body, it was shot completely in two. So there's a piece that big missing from his portal vein. He said if I'd found him as a 20-year-old GI on the battlefield in Vietnam, I'd have shot him full of morphine and just sewed him up and waited for him to die. There's no way he can live. So anyway, it was just devastating. But he said I'm grateful for one thing. He said he told us when he was coming in, he was in terrible pain. He said, I'm so glad to see you. So I got here just in time. It was a staff of battlefield surgeons. Dr. Muir had performed like 10,000 previous battlefield wound surgeries. He'd done everything. He'd seen everything. And he said, the senator told him when the ambulance came to his house, the EMTs said, take him to George Washington Hospital. It's the nearest place. And the senator said, weak as he was, said, no, take me to Walter Reed Military Hospital. They'll have the surgeons I'm going to need. Now, who in that position would have thought of that and all the pain he was in? So anyway, they take him to Walter Reed, and Dr. Muir told us, what I've done is, it's totally experimental. We had an experiment. We took a cow's vein and spliced his portal vein with it. So I think it may or may not take. A body will probably reject it. But the fatal wound was a wound to his pancreas. So the pancreas will cause infection. It'll be extremely painful death, but in 3 or 4 days, he can't possibly live over 3 or 4 days. But he said, we're going to do what we can, and we'll just see what happens. Sure enough, every day we get these updates. And I stayed at the desk at Walter Reed fielding calls from constituents, just the switchboard just overwhelmed with calls of sympathy. And after 3 or 4 days, Dr. Muir says, this is a tough old man. He's still going. There's no sign of infection. Said if there's no infection, he could make it. Said the only danger is infection, and then pancreas will infect everything. And I remember the senator had told me earlier, I just curious, said, what sort of name is Stennis? He said, Scottish. It was originally, when my ancestors came over 4 or 5 generations ago, it was Stenhouse. So our family name was Stenhouse. And Dr. Muir said, this is a tough old Scottish Highlander, and he might make it. So sure enough, eventually they tell us, I can't believe it. It's not possible, but I think he's going to live. I remember, I may have to skip this story. I kind of get emotional. Anyway, I'm going to have to leave that story alone. Anyway, after about a week, the center was able to get visitors, so he had me come in. And he was, you know, as usually, he went to gesture school. I think he always, when they took his picture, he wouldn't let him take it until he was pointing. He always, looked like he was in charge. Anyway, he said, "You've got one job from here on out. As long as I live, I want you to get with the FBI and the prosecutors, and I want the men who did this to me. They ruined my life. I want them punished severely. If they can get the death penalty, that's what I want. But I want you to do nothing but work on this case. That's your job from now on." So I started meeting with the D.C. police and the FBI, and for about 2 months, nothing happened. When they robbed him, he was sort of proud of this. He didn't, I once tried, I thought I'd get a fancy money clip with an old silver dollar and everything. And after about 2 months, I realized they had worn a hole in my pants pocket, so I didn't have a money clip anymore. But the senator carried his money in just an old paper clip. He'd just stick it in his pocket, and he said he had given his wife that morning all of his money. He said, "All I had in my pocket was 35 cents, a nickel and three thin dimes." And the robbers stopped him out in front of his house, demanded money, and he said I was in no position to give it to him. So I offered him about $5,000 watch that had been given to him in Switzerland on a visit. And they took the watch and then shot him anyway. And if you read the book, I put in portions of the transcript, and that's what I'm donating to the dean and the library, is the 5-volume transcript, the only one in the world, the transcript of the trial of the shooter. It's 5 big volumes, beautifully bound. You'll see them in a little bit. Anyway, it was just nothing. They shook down every informant, and then suddenly one day, they got a call from the D.C. police, and some guy had walked in, and he was a big man, about 6'6", with a huge black beard down like this, squared off. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He drove a garbage truck for this Washington, D.C. He said he was driving down the street, and this young black girl ran out in front of him, and he almost hit her. So he dodged her, and about the time he looked in the rearview mirror, and a guy came out with a piece of wood, like an axe handle, and was whacking her on the head. When he saw her, she was bleeding all down her face. She had this bright red hair. He was whacking her on the head, beating her. So the garbage collector, who was also black, he decided to come back. He turned around, he came back and made the block, and the guy's standing out in the street hitting the woman, and she just bleeding all over the place. And he gets up and said, "Say, you need to stop that." And the guy says, "Butt out, it's none of your business." And he says, "I'm not butting out, I'm not allowing you to do this." And the guy says something or other, and the woman said, "You're so smart," to her. The guy says, "You're so smart. Why don't you tell him how you shot that senator?" And the guy, of course, it was all over the front page of the news and national news, TV and everything. And he said, "Girl, he might be the police. Why are you saying that?" She said, "I'm saying that because you did it." And this guy thinks, So anyway, he says, so the guy points to him, and the beater grabs him and said, "This is my wife. I'm going to do what I want to." And he takes her off. So the garbage collector, he drives around a block, stops the first policeman he sees and tells him about it. And they immediately figure out who it is from the description. You know, it's in Northeast Washington neighborhood where everybody knows everybody. A friend of mine used to live right there on the same street. So anyway, this guy, they bring him in, question him in the police. I don't want to get off on too many legal technicalities, but you see the problem is, okay, she doesn't want to testify, and her statement is hearsay if she doesn't testify. If we put the garbage collector on, he's not supposed to testify what she said, except, okay, and also it's called the marital privilege. She can't testify about a marital communication. However, it was stated in front of a third party, which means there's no marital communication privilege, that she accused him of doing it, and he didn't deny it, which is called, his not denying it is admission by silence. So that was the theory we went to trial with. It was just really made your head hurt, about as complicated as you can get from evidentiary standpoint. So we go to trial, and the senator had been under so much morphine that he couldn't remember much about the shooting. One time, the police kept trying to question him. One time, he said the guy was about 15 years old and 6'5". Another time, he thought he was maybe 5'8" and weighed 180. He was just out of his head. And because of that, the judge said, I'm not going to allow you to identify the defendant if you see him in court. So we get to the trial, and the senator, he assigns me. I'm sitting there, and he says, if I put there's a bench in front of the witness chair. He says, if I lace my fingers together like this, that means I can identify him. And so he'd been testifying for maybe an hour, and I thought I was watching, but somehow I must have been negligent. I didn't notice it, and he keeps saying like this. And finally, he gives up on his legal counsel and said, Your Honor, I've been looking at the man over there, and I think I can say without any doubt that man, he said, no. So the judge stops him, and we go back and have a hearing in chambers. The judge says, I'm not going to allow, you didn't give warning, and I'm not going to allow you to testify. And Senator Sense, like, the man who shot me and crippled me, you're not going to allow me to testify as an eyewitness? That's him? Judge says, that's right. So I was really feeling bad. Anyway, we go on with the trial, and I'm looking at the jury, and the jury looks bad. He's a Southern segregationist senator. Although I have to say, in my book, you'll see, somebody asked me, how'd you work for a liberal judge and then a conservative senator? I said, well, you have to know him. You have to know him. And I was reading before I wrote my book, I was reading a book by Joe Biden, who was a big friend of Senator Stennis. And somebody asked him, said, what about Senator Stennis's positions on race? And he said, well, I'll tell you, he came from a certain background at a certain era, but he was different from the rest. He was not a hater. Those bills he voted for, said his heart was not in it. And I always took that from Senator Biden, who said his main issue in the world was civil rights. Told us Senator Stennis that. So anyway, we come down to, there were three people in the robbery. There was the shooter, and there was his brother who held the senator while the other one shot him. And there was a driver of the car. And the driver of the car finally gave a statement that said everything, told the whole case. And we felt like we were not going to be able to get a conviction. The jury looked really hostile. They looked, it was kind of a weak case anyway, and given the racial atmosphere of the times. So finally, the defense attorney said, look, if Derek Holloway, who was the driver of the getaway car, he wasn't in on the shooting. I said, if Holloway testifies, we'll cop a plea. In the middle of the trial, we'll plead guilty. And Senator Stennis, we'd ask him about it. He said, no, and they're all going to prison. Nobody who is involved in that is going to be let off. So the two prosecutors, one of whom, Roger Hailman, was the one who prosecuted the case on the shooting of President Reagan. He said, John, it's up to you, boy. You got to go with the senator tonight and meet with him and talk him into agreeing to the deal. That was one of the lowest moments of my life. I had to sit down and look the senator in the eye. He looked at me and he said, I know what you want. You want to let him off. The man who crippled me and shot me and caused me all this pain, you want to let him off, don't you? Well, no, sir. He's already charged in 3 other street robberies. He's going to be convicted, but we need to win this case. And the jury's going to find this man not guilty. He said, well, it's on you. I believe you. I trust your judgment, and I trust your character. But it's just on you. So I wasn't in the courtroom. I don't know what's going to happen. So anyway, he said, but if you say do it, we'll do it. And sure enough, the guy pled guilty. The judge sent him away forever. And the driver was convicted on 3 other armed robberies. And so he went to prison too. But that case, I'd been always thought I'd be a criminal defense attorney. When I saw that case, it made me want to be a prosecutor. And I went in private practice briefly in Washington after that, and then came back to Mississippi and signed up to be a prosecutor for 3 years. I was kind of reluctant to sign away 3 years of my life, but then I stayed 33. And the rest of my life I spent prosecuting cases. And on the side, I taught at the law school, and thanks to the senator letting me write for the Washington Post, I started writing for the Clarion Ledger. Then the Gannett that owned USA Today syndicated me. I did that, and Reagan and the girls and I got to fly around the United States, San Francisco and New York and New Orleans, and taste the best food and the best wines and write all that up as columns, which are now, and these are all 100 old columns. So that was kind of my history with Senator Stennis. You always need an exit line, and I'm gonna have to search for one here. Oh, I've got it. Had it in my pocket all along, just didn't know. But two things. One thing is, if you want to know about the United States Senate, there's a book I finished about a year ago. I'm in a little reading group. We don't call it a book club because then you have to read the books and talk about them seriously. We just kind of shoot the bull and read what we can. But it's called The American Senate. It was written by Neil McNeil, who died as the book was almost finished, a real expert. And the book was finished by an aide to Senator Robert Byrd, who's one of Senator Stennis's best friends. And he talks, if you're a little bit discouraged about our government, this takes it back, and you won't believe how bad the Senate was in other days. And probably one of the highest moments of the Senate was when Senator Stennis was there. There were so many distinguished senators who compromised. I tell you this little story. One of the senator's favorite people was Ted Kennedy. He disagreed with him on everything except on a personal basis. They do deals on a handshake. The other one of his biggest opponent was, he said, one thing I want you to do, I want you to combat Senator Jacob Javits from New York. So he's the smartest senator, and he's got the smartest staff, and I want you to try to wrestle with him and overcome him. And Senator Javits and Senator Stennis together wrote the War Powers Act, which is now being invoked today as we talk about what to do about ISIS and what to do about Ukraine and all this. But so the Senate comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, and that book, The American Senate, will make you feel better. We've had a bad 10 or 12 years of wrangling and pettiness, but there's a book by William S. White called The Citadel, and I'm just going to end with this quote since I don't want to be quoting myself. It says, "The making of a good United States senator involves several intangibles: a credible emanation of ultimate good faith in what he or she is about. One of the main criteria of good faith being the absence of petty exhibitionism." Boy, have we seen plenty of that lately. "An understanding acceptance of the requirement of compromise, and therefore a willingness to abide dissent. A concentration upon the coherent and important, and an avoidance of the diffuse and boastful. A deep skill in sensing what may and may not be done. A gift, if not for friendship, at least for amicable association with other minds and with the interests of others." That's very subtle, and being a senator is no small deal. "Of purely human qualities, there are yet more. The really good senator must be a person of such sensitivity, a sensitivity not expressed by mere softness, as to be able to perceive those odd surges of feeling that mysteriously move among people generally, sometimes informing and sometimes obscuring the true meaning of issues before the Senate. A senator need not be particularly skilled in every kind of human relationship, but this instinct of high discrimination is indispensable. It is sometimes the only quality that stands athwart hysterical action." It's very interesting now. I think there are 20 women in the Senate. I'm still waiting to see what influence the women have. It's very, very fascinating to see. They thought they'd make it a kindler, gentler place. Maybe that might have worked out yet, but the senator's probably best friend in the Senate was a woman, Margaret Shea Smith, who was the widow of a senator from Maine. One of my favorites was the lady who just retired. Anyway, okay. That's the only senior moment I've had yet. Okay. Then this applies particularly to Senator Stennis. It really reminds me of him personally. A senator must have a considerable, essential ardor for life, which is what Senator Stennis had when he was shot. An élan vital, when you use the French phrase, I don't know if that means like a vital driving force that is constant, if not necessarily intense, to survive in a trying and hazardous way of life. So that's what, I think we still have people like that. I think they're starting to come forward. And that's what Senator Stennis had, and that's what I was privileged to witness in my years there. And I just wanted to tell you as members of the Mississippi State family and admirers of Senator Stennis, especially the students, that's, to me, that's kind of what it's all about. So I thank you for inviting me.
John, thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Here's one.
Did you see any personality change in Senator Stennis after he was shot from the previous senator?
Actually, no, although, if anything, I think he became a little more combative about what he believed in. Even as, like all of us, have a near-death experience, it made him appreciate it even more. I think he became a little more intense. I remember he said, one time, he said that his mentor was Senator Russell of Georgia. And Senator Russell called him aside when he was in Senator Stennis and said, I want you to tell me if you ever see me slipping mentally. I trust you to tell me if I'm slipping. So Senator Stennis called me, he said, when Senator Russell started getting a little senile, Senator Stennis called him aside and said, will you ask me to tell you, and as your friend, I'm telling you, I think you're slipping. He said, blankety. He said that. So Senator Stennis said, I'm not going to say that to you. He said, if you say it to me, it'll probably just make me mad. And when he did start losing it, he was in denial. But until he actually had his mind perfect until he retired. Exactly retired. Most senators, after they retire, go downhill fairly quickly. But I guess the answer would be he was a little more intense. He believed even more in what he was doing after he was shot.
Any other questions or comments? Well, John, we do thank you again. Before Brianne comes and adjourns us, I wanted to remind you all that we do have some of the books here outside for sale. And also, I wanted to ask Dr. Gilbert and Mr. Hailman to come forward and let him present to Dr. Gilbert the official set that he has brought us today that further documents our resources here on the shooting of Senator Stennis.
I might say, Dr. Gilbert, it's a pleasure to present these. I've always wanted to do this. When I left the senator, he insisted I take these. The Armed Services Committee had these. There's only one of these. It's unique in the world. It's the entire, you see the printed on very fine paper, the entire transcript of the case against the three men who shot him. And it's wonderfully presented. And I was honored that when he presented it to me, and I want to present it to Mississippi State. It's unique. This is the only copy I know of.
John, we're very honored to receive this, and on behalf of Mississippi State, I thank you for this donation to Mississippi State. Thank you.
Very much. My pleasure.
Thank you so much again, Mr. Hailman, for coming and sharing about the life of Senator Stennis with us today and how he touched your lives as well as the lives of others. We truly appreciate it. On behalf of the library and the Stennis Montgomery Association, we would like to present you a gift as a token of our gratitude for coming with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for showing up today. Once again, one more thank you to Mr. Hailman for coming to speak. At this time, that concludes our event, but you're welcome to stick around for refreshments as well as the book signing and of Midnight to Guntown afterwards. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.